Hello everyone, welcome to writtenlegalenglish.pl. In this first unit we will look at one of the most important writing rules, the relationship between the subject, verb and object in a sentence. First of all, what's the problem? Well, there are two problems. One, the subject-verb-object structure isn't followed in legal writing, and two, the subject, verb and object are separated by lots of text. Why is this a problem? The easiest structure to understand in English is the active voice. In other words, the subject-verb-object structure. We know who is doing what to whom. In other words, we know the whole relationship which you're trying to present. The thing or person that does, what's being done, and the personal thing which is being affected. If we change the subject-verb-object order, the reader might not be able to identify the subject or object. Further, the reader might confuse the subject and object, which would lead to your text being misunderstood. When reading a text, the reader always tries to establish the relationship between the subject, verb and object. So, if you put lots of information between the subject, verb and object, the reader may get lost in the text. And in trying to find these three elements, the reader might then focus on the other information you've included and miss the main or central point that you're trying to make. Your message will not be communicated clearly. I'm sure you've all experienced this before. You've read something which at first reading isn't clear, or you have to battle through the text to pick out the pieces of the main message from within that text. And then to make sure you've understood the message, you have to go back to the beginning, reread it again to work out exactly what's going on. Well, this is generally due to the writer not following the subject-verb-object structure or putting lots of information between the subject, verb and object. What's the solution? Keep the subject-verb-object structure or active voice and keep the distances between the subject, verb and object short to help understanding. Put all extra information and related points in follow-up sentences. How do we do this? English is a language in which the verb is the most important element of a sentence. The verb communicates the action of a sentence. When reading a verb, the reader will then try to establish the relationship between the subject who does the verb and the personal thing the subject is affecting, the object. Let's consider the following sentence. I am representing a client in court. I is the subject, representing is a form of the verb, a client is the object. In this sentence, the message is clear and precise. We know straight away who is doing what to whom. If this sentence was presented another way, for example, the client is being represented in court, we know something is being done to someone, but important information is missing. The question the reader will instantly have is, who is representing the client? In other words, where's the subject? It might be the case that the writer wants to include the subject, but also wants to keep the passive voice because the writer mistakenly believes that the passive is formal or legal. As a result, you get something like this. The client is being represented by me in court. Here the writer has included the subject by using by to do so, but what the writer has done is make a classic mistake which you commonly see in legal writing, misusing the passive to communicate a message which should be active. Just to briefly explain, we can of course use the passive, but only if we meet one of the three rules that we'll meet in Unit 8. Fortunately, correcting this error is easy. We know the three elements, the subject, verb and object. We just need to reword the artificial passive into an active form. Take a few seconds to read this example sentence. When editing your own work, sometimes it's worth asking yourself, what is the basic main message I'm trying to communicate? When you do this, very often you automatically find that you use the correct subject-verb-object order. If we search between all of the words of this text, the main message is the purchaser must return the item in 14 days. This new basic sentence follows the subject-verb-object order and the reader is immediately informed. All the other information is important, but it is extra information to this main message. Looking back at the example sentence, to identify the subject, verb and object, we can see that the object appears first, then the verb, and then the subject. It follows a passive structure. As a result, to understand the main message, as you most likely did, you have to read, reread, analyse, and then finally understand. It's much easier to state your message clearly first, and then present all the extra information in following sentences. The purchaser must return the item in 14 days. The item must be undamaged, unused, and in its original packaging. The item must be returned with proof of purchase and original delivery docket. Please note that to be clearer, we've had to use extra words, so don't be afraid to increase word count to make a message clearer. Let's have a closer look at our two example sentences. We can see the subject, verb and object in each. However, in both cases, we can see that we have two objects, a direct object and an indirect object. This is important as in legal writing, we have to identify the direct and indirect object to put them in the correct order. Generally speaking, the direct object goes first. It's easy to identify the direct object. Ask yourself, who or what does the verb affect? In the first example, the verb is represent. So ask yourselves, represent who? The answer is, of course, the client. The indirect object can be found by asking yourself for or in or by who or what. In this case, it is representing in front of the court. The version I am representing in court a client would be wrong. Similarly, the purchaser must return in 14 days the item would also be wrong. The rules of English grammar say that the order is flexible, that the indirect object can go before the direct object, and yes, for purposes of style, this is possible. However, for purposes of clarity, the direct object should always come first in legal writing. To recap, 1. Try to keep the subject-verb-object order if possible, and 2. Keep the distances between the subject, verb and object as short as possible. Put all extra information connected to the main message in following sentences. Now we know what the problem is, why it is a problem, and how to fix the problem, we can now test the rule by doing the questions below. However, if you're unsure about any of the points which I've made, please go back and watch the video again. Feel free to pause the video to review all examples at your own speed. After you do a question below, you can click to see a suggested answer. Just before you get started though, please note the following. Please read the question and the hint carefully to make sure you complete the questions properly. Don't just get stuck into the questions, read what you have to do first. In the suggested answer, there may also be further comments to a particular question, so please read these comments carefully. The suggested answers are just that, suggested. There may of course be other also correct ways to answer each question. I've tried to put in as many variants as I can, but for obvious reasons I can't write every single correct answer, so as long as your answer follows the main points highlighted in the suggested answer, your answer should be okay. The questions are designed to practice the rule in this unit, so although you can make further corrections to the rest of the text based on the other rules in the course, the answer only concentrates on the rule in this unit. And finally, please don't get lost in the legalities of the question text. It's there only to provide material to practice the rule, not to be a law lesson. All that being said, off you go.